A rolling ocean of golden grass stretching as far as the eye can see, interrupted only by wild mustangs galloping across the horizon. Or perhaps a single oak tree, its branches bent and scarred, still clinging to life in a land that rarely shows mercy. This is the western frontier, a place where the sky feels endless and moody, where every cloud could be a promise or a threat. It was here that tribes like the Arikara, Pawnee, Crow, and others built their homes, centuries before radar screens or weather sirens warned anyone of approaching storms. These people didn't just endure nature's fury, they adapted, even flourished, in a land that could shift from gentle to catastrophic faster than a heartbeat. So how did they manage it? How did they stand against one of the most violent forces of nature without modern shelters or apps buzzing warnings on their phones? Let's step into their world, their ingenuity, their courage, and the emotions that turn storms into stories worth remembering. The western frontier was no stranger to tornadoes. Warm, humid air sweeping up from the Gulf slammed into dry currents rolling down from the Rockies, creating what meteorologists today call the perfect storm machine. America still sees about 1,200 tornadoes a year, with states like Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas taking the hardest hits. But long before modern maps drew Tornado Alley, native people lived right in its heart. They had no concrete bunkers or steel beams, but they did have something else, an almost spiritual connection with the land. Generations of survival carved wisdom deeper than any textbook. Take the Arikara, for example. They called tornadoes Winata, not just a big wind, but a spirit horse with the mane of lightning and the tail of a serpent. To them, a tornado was alive, a being you could reason with. When thunderheads stacked high, elders gathered, lit sacred pipes, and released smoke toward the storm, offering prayers and asking it to pass them by. Sometimes the storm did veer away, and in those moments, they believed their voices had been heard. Imagine standing before a roaring sky, clutching nothing but a pipe, and believing faith alone could turn aside destruction. That is courage born of desperation, and hope. The Crows saw tornadoes differently. They called them Big Whirl, believing each storm reset the world, tearing away the old so balance could return. To them, a storm was less an enemy and more a stern teacher, reminding people how fragile life was. One elder once said, "The whirlwind does not destroy. It restores." For a people whose villages could be swept aside in minutes, this was not just belief, it was survival wrapped in meaning. Their homes, conical lodges built from buffalo hides and strong poles, were marvels of design. Wind rolled over them instead of breaking them. And when danger grew too great, families could dismantle and carry their homes within an hour, moving to safer ground. Flexibility was survival. But what strikes hardest is not just their structures, or even their rituals, it is their unity. When storms loomed, women tied down lodges with extra hides, children gathered supplies, and elders whispered guidance from memory. Afterward, whole communities rebuilt together, sharing food, tools, and shelter. To the modern eye, a tornado is chaos, something to fear. To these tribes, it was also a reminder, life is fragile, but together we are strong. So, as you listen tonight, imagine the prairie winds whispering through tall grass, elders raising prayers to the darkening sky, and families bracing not only with fear, but with unshakable hope. That, more than anything, was how they survived. Not every storm was seen as a mindless destroyer. To the Powaka people of the rolling Midwest prairies, the whirlwind was a messenger of balance, tearing down only what needed to be renewed. One of their elders, a gray-haired healer named Elias Redcloud, often told the story of the night a monstrous twister nearly erased his village. It was the spring of 2015, and a storm system roared across the flatlands near Amarillo, Texas. Meteorologists later called it one of the widest tornadoes on record, over 2.5 miles across. Families huddled in fear, clutching their children, while the sky roared like a living beast. Yet Elias and 3 other elders, men in their 70s and 80s, stood outside their lodge. With trembling hands but unwavering eyes, they lit cedar branches, letting the smoke curl into the churning heavens. They sang in voices cracked by age but heavy with faith, asking the storm to show mercy. Against every prediction, the funnel veered away at the last moment, missing the village by less than a mile. To the meteorologists on TV, it was unpredictable atmospheric dynamics. To the Powaka, it was proof that the storm had listened. People wept openly that night, not just from relief, but from the belief that the spirit still walked with them. This faith wasn't unique to them. Many tribes had their own ways of seeing tornadoes as more than random violence. The Lenape spoke of the sky dancer, a woman with braided hair whipping in every direction, her fury capable of flattening whole camps. The Mandan whispered about the twisting brother, a force who could punish or bless, sometimes leaving strange gifts, stones, animal bones, or visions that shaped the future. Imagine a storm so terrifying that it leaves not only wreckage but also hope in its wake. These stories weren't just campfire legends meant to frighten children. They shaped survival itself. People believed that to live with storms, one had to respect them, speak to them, and prepare for them as partners rather than enemies. Preparation, of course, was practical as much as it was spiritual. The Powaka lived in tall lodges built from elm wood and hides. Their design wasn't accidental. Steep roofs and rounded frames let the wind roll off instead of crushing the walls. Unlike the square cabins of European settlers, too rigid, too stubborn, these homes flexed and endured. And when survival meant moving, they could dismantle a lodge in less than an afternoon. Horses dragged sleds loaded with poles and hides, allowing families to shift camp quickly if the land felt uneasy. Mobility wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. How did they know when to move? By listening. The silence of birds, the restless twitching of horses, or a sky tinted green were enough to make an elder gather the people. Children were taught to notice the heaviness of the air, or how the insects vanished before a storm. To ignore these signs was to invite disaster. Over time, these lessons became part of memory and history. On buffalo hides, elders painted spirals to mark summers of great cyclones. On stone carvings, they etched jagged lines to remind future generations, the storm is both destroyer and teacher. Their calendars were not just dates, they were survival maps, emotional reminders of nights when fear turned to faith. Those painted hides and etched stones weren't just decoration. They were living records, reminders of storms, hunts, and moments when the heavens themselves seemed to lean down and touch the earth. Imagine keeping a diary where Thursday wasn't about errands or chores but about the day the wind lifted an elk into the clouds or the night the stars burned red before a storm. That was how the Wapiti people remembered, a history written not in ink, but in survival. Of course, not every storm left behind a story of triumph. Sometimes, the sky's fury erased entire camps. An early traveler, Thomas Carver, once recorded a Wapiti tale about Tahoua, the sky serpent. In one storm, the elders said, Tahoua coiled through the valley, whipping up a funnel so fierce it swept deer and even horses into the air until they vanished into specks. For the children who grew up with that story, the lesson was clear, you don't laugh at the storm, you bow to it. Respect was the only shield. But daily life couldn't stop for fear. On the high plains of what is now eastern Colorado, families still rose at dawn, smoke curling from lodge fires as women ground wild grains and prepared hides while men saddled horses for the hunt. Storms were a threat, yes, but they were just one of many. A bad hunt meant hunger. A broken alliance meant war. A hard winter meant frost stealing lives in the night. Survival wasn't about avoiding danger, it was about balancing everything at once. The bison were at the heart of it all. To the Wapiti, the great shaggy beasts were not just animals but providers, teachers, even spiritual guides. Their hides became roofs, their bones became tools, their sinews stitched clothing and weapons. A single bull could keep a family fed for weeks. But hunting them was never easy. Picture this, a dozen riders, young and old, thundering across the prairie, their voices rising above the hoofbeats, waving cloaks to drive a herd toward a narrow canyon. The ground shook like the sky itself was about to break open. And just as the herd surged forward, the air grew heavy, the wind turned still, and the oldest hunter, a man named Josiah Greyfeather, 70 winters old, raised his hand. "The storm is watching," he said, and every rider knew what he meant. Above them, the clouds stacked like mountains, green and black, waiting. That's how storms intruded, not politely, not with warning, but suddenly, in the middle of life's most fragile moments. Imagine trying to trap a 1,000-pound bison while the horizon twists itself into a funnel. You could almost hear the sky mocking human plans. Yet the people adapted. Children learned drills from their earliest years, racing each other to see who could dive fastest into gullies or behind boulders. Women tied down the lodges with extra hides and stones whenever the wind began to moan. Elders kept the stories alive, so that even in laughter around the fire, survival knowledge flowed beneath the surface. Tornadoes, in their world, were like unwelcome relatives, loud, destructive, and impossible to ignore. But just as with troublesome kin, the Wapiti had learned a quiet truth: you cannot banish them, but you can be ready. And readiness, passed from one heart to another, was what turned survival into something more. It turned it into wisdom. The Clearwater people, who roamed the wide valleys of what is now northern New Mexico, had a gift their neighbors admired: they could move faster than storms. Their homes, simple conical shelters of elk hide and pine poles, could be taken apart in less than an hour. Women and children packed the hides and poles onto long wooden sleds, draggers, as they called them, pulled by sturdy ponies or even dogs. Then, with a few whistles and shouts, the whole village was gone, slipping into a canyon or valley floor that offered shelter. This wasn't just convenience, it was life insurance. The Clearwaters knew the prairie sky could turn cruel in minutes. A still morning could become a nightmare by dusk. Mobility gave them an edge over settlers who arrived later with their square cabins and stubborn refusal to move. To the Clearwaters, those cabins looked like invitations for the wind to test its strength. But storms could not always be outrun. That is where their second skill came in: their eyes. Every hunter, every grandmother, even the smallest children learned to read the sky like a book. A sudden hush in the meadow, the restless shifting of the horses, the low sweep of swallows diving for cover, these were warnings. 75-year-old Mara Stonebird used to say, "The silence of the earth is the loudest voice of all." And when she spoke, people listened. If she told families to gather their belongings, they did not hesitate. They didn't have barometers or radio warnings, but they didn't need them. The tilt of the wind, the metallic taste in the air, the way clouds stacked in uneven layers, these told them everything. By the time the first clap of thunder shook the ground, they were already halfway to a ravine, children bundled on horses, elders guiding the way. Sometimes, they even used smoke as their signal. Scouts would burn damp grass to send up dark plumes, each shape carrying a meaning. A thick column rising fast meant danger close. Wide smoke drifting eastward meant a storm was building but still far off. It wasn't a text message, but it was enough to save lives. And yet, no matter how careful, storms left scars. A single twister could scatter a buffalo herd or tear through a lodge circle like a careless giant sweeping toys aside. Families could lose their food, their tools, even their kin. But the Clearwaters had a way of answering disaster with resilience. If a tornado ripped up the soil, the women gathered exposed roots or medicinal plants. If poles broke, they were shaped into new tools. Nothing was wasted, not even the storm's anger. It was the women, especially, who stood as the quiet pillars of survival. While men hunted elk or scouted new ground, women kept the heartbeat of the village steady. They stitched moccasins, dried meat, soothed frightened children, and when the winds rose, they were the first to lash down the shelters and herd the little ones to safety. Elder women's councils even decided how to rebuild after disasters. They were not victims waiting for rescue, they were commanders of the storm. But the Clearwaters also carried stories of warning. One tale spoke of a young warrior, Naten Swiftstep, who mocked the land by cutting sacred trees carelessly. Days later, a tornado swept through his camp, destroying nearly everything. Elders said it was the whirlwind mother's revenge. Whether true or not, no child who heard the story ever forgot its lesson: disrespect the earth, and the earth will answer. The Hillstream people carried with them a rule as old as memory: don't provoke the earth, or it will answer you louder than you can bear. It was not simply a proverb but a lived truth. They told stories of hunters who mocked the land by wasting meat or felling trees without prayer, and of the storms that followed, storms that seemed almost personal in their vengeance. Whether these tales were spiritual warnings or just remarkable storytelling hardly mattered. What mattered was that everyone listened. Their beliefs carried into practice. Certain ceremonies were forbidden during the stormy months. Singing particular songs, or striking drums on nights when thunderheads loomed, was said to tempt the spirits of wind. Instead, families left offerings: corn, beads, or tobacco, placed beneath lone cottonwoods or at river bends. To ignore these customs was unthinkable. Better to give a gift than risk angering the unseen. For the Hillstream youth, tornadoes sometimes became more than fear, they became symbols of change. During vision quests, boys of 16 would leave the village and fast alone in the hills. Hungry, weak, and waiting, they prayed for signs. To see a funnel cloud in the distance was considered overwhelming, a direct message from the Great Spirit that their lives were about to be torn apart and rebuilt anew. One elder, Anna Whitewillow, remembered watching her own son climb the ridge for his first fast. When he returned days later, hollow-eyed but carrying a story of a swirling cloud he had seen against the red horizon, she wept. To her, it was not a sign of danger but a promise: the spirits had chosen to speak to him. And so storms became woven into the threads of identity, shaping not just survival but purpose. But survival still depended on structure and unity. The Hillstreams, like so many others of the plains, worked as one body. Elders carried the weight of memory, telling how storms had struck generations before. Women ensured food was dried, hides were sewn, and children were guided. Warriors scouted both enemies and the sky. When the wind began to howl, each person knew their task. If disaster did strike, help was never far. Neighboring bands often shared what they had. A family left homeless might be given food or shelter until they could stand again. The Hillstreams called it Raven's Wing, a principle that no one should ever face a storm alone. It was mutual aid wrapped in kinship, long before governments or relief agencies tried to give it a name. Resourcefulness also defined them. A buffalo hide wasn't just for shelter, it could be salvation. If caught in the open, families huddled beneath hides weighted with stones, hoping the storm's fury would pass over them. No, it wasn't perfect. A tree branch flying at 200 miles an hour cared little for ritual or leather. But in desperation, it was something, and sometimes something was enough. Looking deeper, it becomes clear: the Hillstreams didn't merely endure storms. They danced with them, in ritual, in preparation, and in spirit. Chaos became part of the rhythm of life. Against blizzards that froze rivers, herds that stampeded without mercy, and neighbors who sometimes came as enemies, the tornado was only another partner in the endless, dangerous waltz of survival. And so, when dark clouds piled above the valley, they did not only fear. They prayed, they prepared, and they remembered: storms were not accidents. They were voices with moods, teaching lessons written in wind. When the Raincrest people saw the horizon darken, they didn't only look for shelter, they spoke to the storm. Elders would gather at the edge of camp, burning sage and sweetgrass, lifting the smoke toward the funnel that spun in the distance. Their prayers were not commands but pleadings, words carried upward in the hope that the storm would show mercy. And when the winds shifted, when the funnel curved away, they believed the spirits had listened. There were no studies, no instruments to measure coincidence. Only survival mattered, and survival was enough to prove the ritual worked. The Storm River tribe had their own way of reading balance in the chaos. To them, the great whirlwinds were not random. They were signs that the world had fallen out of harmony. When such storms gathered, their medicine men, elders with painted faces and trembling hands, performed the stone renewal, a ritual of 4 days and nights. Sacred stones, wrapped in hides and feathers, were lifted to the sky, offered back to the forces believed to hold creation together. The idea was simple but powerful: if the earth shook, if the sky roared, it meant something deep was broken, and only ceremony could set it right again. Imagine the courage of standing beneath a storm's roar, shouting prayers into the wind, offering gifts to something that could erase you in seconds. Yet the storm river did it, over and over, their confidence both heartbreaking and inspiring. Other tribes turned ritual into action. The Iron Hill riders told tales of warriors who would gallop straight toward a forming funnel cloud, cloaks snapping, voices raised. They believed that noise and movement could startle the storm, pushing it aside. Perhaps it was coincidence, or perhaps it was courage strong enough to change the air itself. Either way, they didn't wait for fate to choose, they rode into it, daring the storm to pass them by. The Riverbend elders took a quieter path. To them, every tornado was part of the great current, a living river of spirit that flowed through all things. A storm wasn't punishment but a test, a question whispered from the sky. When a boy of 17 saw a funnel during his fasting on the hills, he was told it was not chance. It was a call, a demand that he rise to a new role. Tornadoes, in this way, became not only destroyers but guides. Even objects carried meaning. Medicine keepers in the Sunfeather clan prepared bundles filled with feathers, river stones, and tiny carved bones. When the horizon darkened, a healer would lift the bundle high, chanting to draw power from the sacred items. These were more than charms, they were memory, artistry, belief wrapped in leather and beads. Archaeologists today might call them artifacts, but to those who held them, they were lifelines. Not everything was mystical. Beneath the songs and rituals lay practical wisdom: when to leave a valley, when to lash the shelters tighter, when to keep children close. But for the Raincrest, Storm River, Iron Hill, and Sunfeather alike, the storm was never just weather. It was a presence to be faced, feared, and honored, an adversary, a teacher, sometimes even a messenger. And in their courage, in the trembling of their prayers and the fierce grip of their traditions, we find something more than survival. We find hope, hope that even in the wildest winds, humanity could still speak, still believe, and sometimes, still be heard. The Stone Creek people were practical to their core, and their spirituality was often inseparable from their survival. They knew, for example, that the green valleys near rivers, so tempting for their fertile soil and fresh water, were death traps in storm season. Floods, falling timber, and debris turned those places into graveyards when the winds came. So instead, they built their camps along the ridges, or tucked behind clusters of cottonwoods that could break the gusts. Elder Rowan Ashclaw, 80 winters old, often told the children, "The river sings sweetly, but in spring she turns cruel. Go higher when the sky grows dark." His words, passed down like scripture, saved more lives than any wall of stone could have. The Stone Creeks also looked to the sky for timing. They didn't need a calendar bound in leather, they had stars. When the Pleiades dipped low, they knew storms were near. When Mars glowed red at dawn, they prepared to move. The heavens themselves were their farmer's almanac, written not in ink but in constellations. Stories bound these lessons together. The Willowborn clan spoke of a child named Taya, who once survived when her camp was torn to pieces. The winds roared, the lodges were ripped apart, and people scattered. Taya, only 8 years old, remembered what her grandmother had whispered: "Watch where the bison roll." She ran into a shallow depression, a wallow carved by buffalo, and pressed herself low. The storm leapt over her. When her people found her alive, they told her story for generations. The moral was simple but unforgettable: think like the buffalo and you will endure. It was more than a bedtime tale. It was instruction wrapped in emotion, easy for a child to remember when terror struck. But storms weren't always enemies, they could be allies. The Redfern horsemen, quick and cunning, were known to raid rivals in the chaos of thunderstorms. While lightning split the sky and winds screamed through the grass, their riders appeared like shadows, seizing horses and scattering their foes. Imagine huddling inside your shelter as the walls creak and the ground trembles, only to realize the danger is not the sky, it's men moving with it. The storm was their accomplice, and they wielded it like a blade. Yet destruction also gave way to healing. After a storm flattened camps or scattered herds, the Stone Creeks gathered not in despair but in ceremony. They lit fires, sang mourning songs for what was lost, and gave thanks for what was spared. These weren't empty rituals, they were medicine for the heart. They rebuilt not just their shelters, but their courage. Elder Rowan often reminded his people, the storm tears apart the lodge, but it cannot tear apart the people. Those gatherings, filled with song and prayer, were their disaster recovery long before such words existed. The truth is, the Stone Creeks and their neighbors didn't just endure tornadoes. They absorbed them into their way of life, weaving storms into their culture the way wind weaves through grass. They found ways to prepare, to endure, and even to turn chaos into strategy. Their faith, their pragmatism, and their resilience became more than survival tactics. They became the very fabric of who they were. Because in the end, the storm wasn't just in the sky, it was in their stories, their rituals, and their hearts. And each time it passed, they rose again, stronger for having faced it together. The Windriver people lived their lives to the rhythm of the seasons, the bison, and the moods of the sky. Spring and summer brought both abundance and danger, when warm southern winds clashed with icy air rolling down from the northern peaks. It turned their homeland into a stage for storms, a place where a morning of sunshine could dissolve into an afternoon of terror. But waiting in fear was never an option. Their days were full, so full, in fact, that every hand, young or old, had a role to play. At dawn, men sharpened their lances, preparing for the hunt. Women stretched and tanned hides, their arms moving with the strength of habit, while children carried water or learned to track animals in the dust. Elders sat by the fires, weaving stories into lessons, tales that warned of storms as much as they praised bravery. It was a kind of harmony, every person a thread in the same fabric. Except, perhaps, for the young braves who thought they could outrun a buffalo. Spoiler, they never could. The heart of their survival was the bison. A single hunt could provide meat for weeks, hides for shelter, bones for tools, and sinew for bowstrings. But the storms often tested this balance. Imagine a young hunter, Caleb Stronghand, 20 years old, creeping toward a herd after hours of silent stalking, only to look up and see the horizon darken, a funnel lowering like a black fist from the sky. In that moment, he had to decide, finish the hunt and risk the storm, or retreat and pray the herd remain tomorrow. The Windriver hunters learned to use the land as ally. If a storm built overhead, they would guide herds toward gullies or sheltered valleys, letting the terrain shield them from both wind and prey. It was like playing a game of chess with two opponents at once, one weighing 1,000 pounds, the other roaring from the heavens. Their ingenuity didn't stop at hunting. Elders remembered the buffalo fall, a technique where entire herds were driven over cliffs so that gravity did the work. Archaeologists still find bones stacked high at such places. But even this cleverness bowed to storms. A single twister could scatter herds for miles, leaving bellies empty and fires without meat. That is why the women carried equal weight. They knew every root, berry, and wild fruit. Elder Naomi Redfern, 70 winters old, could identify plants with a glance. She taught the children, chokecherries for food, prairie turnips for survival, and bright red berries you must never touch. When storms drove the men from the hunt, it was these women who fed the camp from the land itself. And they did more. Women were the true engineers of the Windriver lodges. They tightened the hides, drove extra stakes, and piled rocks at the bases when the winds began to howl. Some even braided grass ropes to lash shelters together, turning a circle of lodges into one woven fortress. They didn't have lumber or nails, but with patience and willpower, they crafted safety. Children, too, were never idle. From their first steps, they were trained to notice signs the sky was changing. If ants marched in a perfect line, if birds flew low and restless, or if the horses stamped and snorted, the children knew to alert their mothers. Survival wasn't taught in books, it was taught in whispers, games, and small lessons repeated until instinct took over. The winddriver knew storms could strip away homes and lives. But through discipline, memory, and unity, they made the chaos of the sky part of their daily rhythm. In every sharpened lance, every scraped hide, and every child's wide eyes staring at the horizon, there was preparation. Because for them, survival wasn't luck, it was a way of life. Among the Stormhaven people, even children were trained by play. When the air grew heavy and the animals grew restless, the little ones were taught a game called hide from the sky. Elders would clap or whistle, and the children would scatter, diving behind rocks, into gullies, or pressing themselves into tall grass. It looked like laughter and fun, but it was survival disguised as play. By the time they reached their teenage years, those same children could spot the curling edge of a funnel cloud faster than most modern weather apps can send an alert. It wasn't just games. Their entire way of life demanded resourcefulness. The Stormhaven toolkit was simple: stone knives sharp enough to cut hides, bones polished into needles, sinew braided into thread, bows of ashwood curved with care. When storms ripped apart a camp, no one wept over broken things. They rebuilt. A shattered lodge pole. Carve another from a cottonwood. A torn hide. Stitch it with sinew and scraps from the last hunt. It wasn't luxury, it was survival. Some of their tools were downright ingenious. Buffalo shoulder blades, for example, weren't discarded after the hunt. They became shovels, used to clear storm debris or dig shallow shelters. Not elegant, perhaps, but when your choice is between scooping dirt with bone or being swept away by 150 miles per hour of wind, practicality wins. And here's where their resilience became art. After storms passed, some families would wander the wreckage, picking up twisted branches, scorched stones, or roots ripped from the soil. They called them gifts of the whirlwind mother. These odd shapes were carved into totems or painted with ochre, then placed near the lodges. They were tokens of gratitude: thank you for sparing us. Imagine turning destruction into beauty, chaos into art. It was their way of pulling meaning from the merciless sky. Storms didn't just interrupt life, they rearranged it. Spring, for example, was the season not only of twisters but of tribal gatherings. It was when people traded hides, food, and stories, when they renewed bonds with distant kin. But if the winds howled, everything paused. A great ceremony, planned for weeks, might be postponed or moved across valleys. The elders had no shame in bending plans to weather's will. Flexibility wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. Compare that to settlers who planted houses in storm alleys and refused to move, even when nature begged them to. The Stormhaven also carried stories like warnings stitched into memory. Elders often gathered children close and told of young warriors who ignored advice. One tale spoke of Elias Swiftfoot, who camped by the riverbed though his grandmother had warned him it would flood. When the storm came, he was swept away before dawn. His name became a lesson, whispered in every family: ignore the land, and you will not return. These stories weren't meant to frighten. They were manuals disguised as myths, making lessons unforgettable. Like a grandmother today telling her grandson to wear a coat lest he catch cold, only in this case, the cold was a funnel cloud that could snap trees like twigs. Through games, tools, art, and stories, the Stormhaven taught each generation that storms were not just obstacles, they were teachers. Harsh, unforgiving, but also shaping, molding. And in learning from them, the people did more than survive. They grew stronger, carrying wisdom carved by the wind itself. The Ironwood people didn't just endure storms, they absorbed them into the rhythm of their existence. From the way they hunted to the way they played to the way they turned shattered branches into sacred carvings, every gust of wind was folded into daily life. But the prairie was never just about weather and chores. It was also about the tangled web of people, the neighbors, allies, and rivals who could be just as unpredictable as the sky itself. For the Ironwood and their neighbors, survival meant more than food and shelter. It meant knowing who might ride to your aid, and who might wait for the wind to knock you down before striking. Storms, in their strange way, became part of this delicate diplomacy. The prairie was alive with tribes, each guarding its hunting grounds, each carrying traditions, each holding grudges that stretched back generations. The river wolf and stone axe were allies one year, trading hides and even sealing their bond with marriages. But by the next, a quarrel over buffalo ranges could turn them into enemies. And then there were the fire horse riders, notorious for their lightning raids, who seemed to delight in stirring trouble wherever they went. But when the storms came, grudges sometimes bent beneath the weight of survival. Picture this: it is spring, tornado season, and two bands, the Cedarwind and the Night Drift, camp only a few miles apart, each wary of the other's presence. The air grows heavy, green with warning, and a funnel dips from the clouds. In that moment, nobody is thinking about stolen horses. Both camps scatter for shelter, and some find themselves huddled together in the same ravine, pressing close, praying the storm will spare them. When it passed, they looked at one another differently, not as rivals, but as fellow survivors. Archaeologists later found pipes of one tribe alongside arrowheads of another, proof that even sworn enemies sometimes faced the sky as one. It was a kind of truce, born not from negotiation, but from the humbling force of nature. Yet storms could also be wielded as weapons. The fire horse riders, clever and ruthless, sometimes launched raids in the midst of thunder and wind. When their enemies huddled in fear of the sky, the fire horse came with knives and speed, using the chaos as cover. Imagine crouching inside your lodge, listening to the wind scream, only to hear hoofbeats thundering through the storm. By the time you realized, it was too late. The fire horse weren't just fighting men. They were partners with the tempest itself. On the other side, kindness also bloomed in the storm's wake. When a twister flattened a camp, runners were sent to allied villages. The ash pine, for example, had a tradition of sending dried venison and roots to any neighbor struck by disaster. It was more than charity, it was insurance. Today's giver might be tomorrow's beggar, and generosity ensured that no one faced ruin alone. This dance of rivalry and alliance, of truce and betrayal, made the prairie not just a battlefield of storms, but a stage where human hearts were tested. Tornadoes didn't only tear down trees and lodges, they tore down pride, exposed weakness, and forced people to choose: would they stand together, or turn against one another? For the Ironwood, the answer was always the same. They believed the storm was watching, judging not only individuals but whole peoples. To stand with others in the storm's shadow was to honor life. To strike while others suffered was to gamble with fate itself. And in that belief, storms shaped not just survival, but the very soul of their diplomacy. After a plentiful hunt, the Pine Hill people often shared their bounty with neighbors: venison, berries, or smoked buffalo meat. It wasn't just generosity, it was a quiet agreement: help us today, and we'll help you tomorrow, when the sky turns cruel. These exchanges created invisible threads of trust, woven tighter each time storms scattered a camp or tore down a village. It was networking, prairie style, except instead of contracts and signatures, it was sealed with food, stories, and handshakes by the fire. Trade was another lifeline. Imagine the great clearings along the Spiritwater River, where tribes gathered from miles away. The plains became open-air markets where hides, flint blades, baskets, and sacred feathers changed hands. There was laughter, competition, even tension, but also a sense that these meetings were vital for survival. Yet storms were never far. A tornado could wipe out a caravan, scatter a year's worth of goods, or drown horses in swollen rivers. And still, the traders adapted. If the storm blackened one path, they found another. If the winds forced delay, they waited, guided by their deep reading of the land. The Cedarvale people were especially famous for their fortified villages. Their lodges stood firm against both raiders and storms. Traders knew if the sky turned, they could shelter within Cedarvale walls. It was less a marketplace and more a sanctuary, part Walmart, part cathedral, where everyone showed up, even enemies who normally would not share a fire. Storms didn't just destroy, they judged. Among the Redstone, there was a tale of two rival bands who quarreled over a rich meadow near the Iron Shadow Hills. The argument grew fierce. Threats turned into the edge of violence. And then, as if summoned, a tornado roared down, flattening both camps. Elders declared it a verdict from the sky, neither would claim the land until they learned to share. The rivals built side by side, held a joint ceremony, and for a time, peace replaced anger. It was nature's way of saying, "You're both children. Now behave." Ceremonies themselves became tools of diplomacy. The Hawkfeather and Wolfstep clans often invited allies to their great dances of renewal, which included prayers for storms to spare their camps. When a funnel cloud bent away at the last moment, it wasn't luck. It was taken as proof of unity, a sign that their alliance was blessed. These gatherings weren't just spiritual, they were summits, where disputes could soften, marriages were arranged, and plans for hunts were made. Storms also tested courage. The Stone Path had a fierce tradition. Young warriors seeking honor might be sent to follow a tornado, tracking its path and returning with news. If they came back alive, they earned new names like Windrider or Stormrunner. It was the ultimate gamble, standing close enough to taste fear, yet wise enough to return. Imagine the pride of a boy of 16 returning soaked, trembling, but alive, while the elders named him before the people. But storms also sharpened rivalries. The Cloud Ridge and Ravenfire people often clashed, raiding each other for horses. Tornadoes became both curse and opportunity. A storm that shattered one camp could make them vulnerable, but the same storm might cripple your own. Choosing when to strike was a gamble against both human and sky. The Pine Hill understood this balance well. They saw tornadoes not just as winds, but as arbiters, forces that exposed weakness, tested bonds, and revealed character. They were nature's courtroom, where every tribe, no matter how proud, eventually had to stand trial. The Frost Valley people knew too well that storms did not only test the land, they tested hearts. Opportunists, like the Greyhawk Raiders, were infamous for waiting until a tornado flattened a rival's camp before swooping in. While families dug through debris, desperate for food or searching for loved ones, Greyhawk warriors would snatch horses or supplies. It was a cruel reminder that the prairie was not only a battleground between people and sky, but also between neighbor and foe. Life here was a chessboard, every move shaped by the whims of the weather. Yet from the chaos rose something profound. Storms were more than tempests, they were political forces. They forced enemies into truces, created bonds between strangers, and turned destruction into stories that gave meaning to survival. In the eyes of the Frost Valley people, storms weren't just dangers, they were teachers, carving lessons into bone and memory. Nowhere was this clearer than in the role of women. If the men were the hunters and defenders, the women were the heartbeat that kept the camp alive. They worked with a rhythm that never slowed, scraping hides, grinding seeds, cooking meals, stitching moccasins, all while watching the sky out of the corners of their eyes. When dark clouds gathered, it was women who became the first wall against disaster. Take Elder Mira Stoneleaf, 60 winters old. When the wind began to roar, she would rally the younger women, driving stakes deeper into the soil, piling stones at the bases of lodges. Some women even pulled heavy buffalo hides across the entrances, creating makeshift shields against flying debris. It was their way of standing between chaos and their children. As Mira once said, "We cannot fight the sky, but we can make sure it does not swallow us whole." Women were also the keepers of nature's secrets. In Frost Valley lore, plant knowledge was passed down mother to daughter like sacred scripture. They knew which roots filled an empty stomach, which leaves healed a wound, and which bark eased a fever. After a storm scattered the herds, it was women who carried the camp through hunger. Imagine sitting in the ruins of your shelter, thinking survival is slipping away, and watching your mother dig up a root that became both food and medicine. That was their quiet genius. Children, too, were never spared from lessons. From the time they could walk, they were trained to recognize the moods of the sky. By 5, they could tell when clouds piled like mountains or when the air smelled sharp and metallic. Storm drills were woven into games, racing to ditches, diving behind rocks, or pretending to hide from spirits. It was less play outside and more practice staying alive. By the time they were teenagers, these children had instincts sharp as any hunter. Some even said women had a special bond with the storm itself. Among the Ashwind clan, tales told of Whirlwind Mother, a spirit both merciful and cruel. Women were chosen to sing to her, weaving songs with trembling voices when tornadoes bore down. One story speaks of Leora Dawnstep, a young woman who sang with such passion during a storm that the funnel lifted and veered away. Did the storm truly hear her? No one could prove it. But the people believed. And belief itself was a shelter. In this way, storms shaped not only survival, but identity. The Frost Valley people saw themselves not as victims of the wind, but as partners in its dance. Women anchored the lodges, children carried the wisdom, and together they stood, fragile but unbroken, while the sky tested their every breath. Among the Stormvale people, women were more than caretakers, they were anchors of survival, voices strong enough to speak to both the living and the sky. Some even joked that they had a direct line to the storm's council, filing complaints whenever the wind grew unruly. It wasn't far from the truth. When storms came, it was often women who raised their hands in prayer, sang to the heavens, and reminded everyone that the spirits might yet be swayed. But their importance went beyond the sacred. When a tornado tore through the lodges, leaving hides shredded and poles snapped, women were the first to act. They gathered what could be saved, fragments of tools, scraps of leather, shards of pottery, and transformed wreckage into renewal. The Swiftbrook clan had societies of women who embroidered clothing and tents with porcupine quills. After storms, they didn't just patch holes, they created new beauty from destruction. A torn hide could become a decorated bag, a ripped lodge cover reborn as a garment. To rebuild was not just practical, it was art, defiance against despair. Children, too, were drawn into this fabric of resilience. Their sharp eyes and endless energy made them the perfect lookouts. The storm veil would send their youngest up ridges or trees to watch the sky. A 7-year-old could be the difference between life and death. If a child spotted the curling shape of a funnel, they'd wave a blanket or call out a cry that echoed through camp. One record tells of a girl named Alina, only 10, who saw a storm rising in the east. She shouted in time, and her people fled just before the tornado tore through. Her name lived in song for years, proof that even the smallest voice could hold back the sky. Women and children also guarded the food stores. When hunts were ruined and herds scattered, it was they who foraged. Elder Irina Cloudstep, gray-haired and steady as stone, led the little ones into the woods and meadows. Together, they gathered wild grapes, chokecherries, and prairie roots. They dried them, mixed them with smoked meat and fat, creating pemmican, food that could last through storms and famine. Imagine standing in the wreckage of your camp, and watching your mother hand you a sweet grape she plucked from the wild. It wasn't just nourishment. It was hope. Storms also became teachers. Elders told children stories not to frighten, but to prepare. One tale spoke of a boy who ignored his grandmother's warning and camped too close to the river. When the tornado came, the waters rose and swept him away. He survived only by clinging to a log. Listen to your elders, the story ended, or the river will teach you itself. The lesson was simple, unforgettable: nature does not forgive carelessness. Even in the realm of spirit, women held power. Among the Ash River, medicine women carried sacred bundles filled with feathers, stones, and even bits of fallen meteorites. When storms threatened, these bundles were opened, songs lifted, and prayers offered. The rituals came with wisdom too, warnings to move to higher ground, or to tie lodges tighter. Faith and practicality braided together, like a rope strong enough to hold against the wind. The truth was clear: women and children weren't supporting players in the story of survival. They were the engine, the memory, and the spirit. Without them, the Stormvale people would not have endured. With them, they not only survived the fury of the plains, they found meaning within it. For the Duskpine people, knowledge and quick thinking turned storms from terrors into challenges they could face together. But life in their homeland, a wide plain where the horizon stretched endless and the wind could shift moods in a heartbeat, wasn't about survival alone. It was about learning to thrive in a world where each dawn carried both promise and peril. Tornadoes never arrived with invitations. They came sudden, loud, and merciless. To live here, the Duskpine had to be more than strong, they had to be wise. Their gift wasn't in muscles or weapons but in their ability to observe, to memorize, to read the language of the land better than any scholar with ink and paper. What modern scientists now describe with instruments, they knew through silence, scent, and sky. The plains were a living book, and the Duskpine were its librarians. Every slope, stream, and patch of grass carried whispers about what was coming. And they listened. Elder Rowan Stormeye, 72 winters old, taught children to respect the quiet. When the meadow grows still, when the air feels heavy on your chest, and the birds stop singing, run, he would say. It was nature's mute button, a warning louder than thunder. And the children, wide-eyed, remembered. They also watched the clouds. Dark towers rising in the west, especially tinged with a strange green light, meant hail and sometimes worse. Science now explains that green glow as sunlight scattering through thick clouds. But the Duskpine didn't need science. Generations of memory were enough. A green sky was danger. Rivers, too, told their own stories. The Windshade and Hollowbrook clans avoided the river bottoms in spring, when floods and tornadoes often struck together. Instead, they chose the higher ridges, often sheltered by cottonwoods or rocky outcrops that bent the wind's force. And when rivers swelled after heavy rains, the Hollowbrook elders read the currents. A river running too high was no place for a camp, for they knew storms always followed water's unrest. It was foresight born from tragedy and carved into tradition. Even the stars became guides. The Skywatchers of the Dawn Trail clan charted constellations, using them as their almanac. When the cluster they called the Seven Sisters, what we know as the Pleiades, rose high in the spring sky, it meant storms were coming soon. No telescope was needed, only memory and discipline. The Dawn Trail went further still. They looked to the morning star, bright in the east, Venus or Mars depending on the season, as their signal. When it glowed red at dawn, elders would whisper warnings, urging families to secure lodges and prepare for the sky's wrath. Imagine standing under a night sky, stars sharp as blades, and knowing each one told you when to plant, when to hunt, and when to hide. That was the Duskpine's weather forecast, not from satellites, but from the heavens themselves. It wasn't superstition, it was survival refined into art. And in the quiet brilliance of their memory, they played chess with the storm while the wind itself fumbled like a child. The Meadowbrook people never saw their homeland as an empty stage for storms to rage upon. To them, every dip, ridge, and hidden stream was part of a living library of survival. They knew the value of a buffalo wallow, a shallow hollow left where bison rolled in the dust. To outsiders it looked like nothing more than a dent in the ground, but to Meadowbrook children, it was a gift from the animals themselves. When the sky blackened and winds roared, elders taught them to dive into these natural shelters. Stories say generations survived by pressing low in those earthen bowls while their camps tore apart around them. Archaeologists would one day find tools and pottery in such places, proof that these hollows were sanctuaries long before anyone dreamed of digging basements. It was as if the buffalo had left behind a survival manual, and the people had the wisdom to read it. The land itself was believed to carry power. Among the cliff song, stories told of sacred ridges and stone circles that could bend a storm's path. One legend described a hill, crowned with a ring of boulders, where people left offerings of beads and tobacco. The elders claimed that tornadoes skirted around it, unwilling to cross the circle. To modern minds it may sound like superstition, yet even science admits that high ground and rough terrain can disrupt a twister's course. Without equations or charts, the cliff song had discovered truths written in the earth itself. Animals, too, were trusted prophets. The swift trail hunters watched antelope, noting how they bolted for cover long before a storm appeared. Prairie dogs vanished underground at the first shift of pressure. Even the camp dogs grew anxious, whining and pacing before the horizon darkened. The people listened. They didn't doubt. If the animals warned of danger, lodges were packed, fires doused, and families moved. It makes you wonder, why do we check our phones for forecasts when a restless dog may know more than a meteorologist? Fire itself became a tool of protection. The Pinevale clans were masters of controlled burns. At the edge of spring, before the great storms, they set small fires to clear the brittle grass. These fire breaks stopped wild blazes from catching and saved camps from being trapped. Evidence of these practices still lies in charred patterns across the Black Hills. To the Pinevale, fire wasn't only destruction, it was defense, a way to fight nature's fury with its own language. And when storms did tear through, the Meadowbrook turned disaster into opportunity. If winds uprooted trees, they shaped the wood into new lodge poles. If the ground cracked open flint, they gathered shards for arrowheads and blades. Elder Tomas Willowborn, 60 winters old, once told his grandchildren, "The storm takes, but it also gives. You only need the eyes to see its gifts." In this way, the land was not an enemy. It was a teacher, a partner, even in fury. From buffalo wallows to sacred hills, from restless dogs to cleansing fires, the Meadowbrook people learned to listen. And listening, they survived. The Riverwind people had a gift for turning hardship into lessons. Their resourcefulness makes you wonder why today we toss away a broken chair instead of mending it. To them, nothing was useless, every splinter of wood, every scrap of hide, carried the promise of another life. They even learned to let the wind itself be their compass. Elder Jareth Longfeather, 70 winters old, often reminded his grandchildren, "The breeze is not just air, it is a path." The Riverwind noted the prevailing winds to guide their migrations. And when tornado season came, sudden shifts in direction told them danger was near. A west wind turning south. It was a whisper to seek cover before the storm had a chance to speak louder. They didn't have barometers, but they had generations of memory, a kind of living anemometer built into their very way of life. This knowledge wasn't locked away in one person's mind. It flowed through stories, songs, and even dances. At night, children would stomp in circles, mimicking the wind's twist, while elders sang verses that described storm signs. It wasn't just entertainment, it was training. Every laugh, every clap of hands, carried lessons that might save them when the horizon turned black. But foresight alone wasn't enough. Preparation was everything. And at the center of that preparation stood their lodges, masterpieces of nomadic engineering. Picture a cone of buffalo hide stretched taut over poles anchored with stones, the Windspire Lodge. It wasn't simply a shelter. It was their storm-proof armor. The cone's slope let the wind slide harmlessly around it, while the opening at the top gave air a way to escape without turning the whole thing into a giant sail. The Riverwind could raise or dismantle one in less than an hour. Families could be packed and moving before thunder even rolled across the prairie. Compare that to the square cabins later settlers built, rigid, proud, and utterly fragile. The storm treated those like toys. The Riverwind trusted flexibility over stubbornness, and that made all the difference. Placement mattered, too. They didn't pitch lodges carelessly. Entrances faced east to greet the rising sun but also angled away from the harsh western winds. Some women, wise in their craft, stitched an extra layer of hide for the stormy months, sewing with sinew thread so tough it outlasted rope. Archaeologists would one day find stone circles where lodges once stood, proof that these homes weren't flimsy, they were fortresses woven from patience and skill. When storms did strike, the riverwind didn't sink into despair. They moved among the wreckage with determination. Women and children scoured the ground for what remained, scraps of hide patched into blankets, broken poles reshaped into spears, bits of food gathered before they spoiled. Elder Mira Ashriver taught her daughters, the storm may scatter, but it never destroys everything. What is left is a gift, if you are willing to see it. Even in the ruins, they built anew. And in that act, mending, repurposing, creating, they found not just survival, but dignity. The Riverwind people never let the storm have the final word. They answered back, stitch by stitch, stone by stone, with resilience stronger than the wind itself. For the Skybrook people, the storm's wreckage was never just ruin, it was possibility. When the winds scattered their camp and left splintered bones, broken wood, and torn hides across the prairie, they didn't despair. They gathered. Women led the charge, collecting buffalo bones, not for mourning, but for renewal. From those bones they carved needles, scrapers, and even fishing hooks. What looked like trash to outsiders became tools for survival. Their thriftiness makes you wonder why we, today, throw away something as simple as a cracked pot or a broken chair. To the Skybrook, nothing was ever wasted, every fragment had another life waiting in it. Sometimes, the storm gave more than scraps. Among the Iron Plain, there was a belief that tornadoes unearthed sacred stones, even gifts fallen from the heavens. After the skies cleared, they combed the churned earth, searching for treasures hidden in the soil. One legend tells of a young man named Jalen Stormrunner, who found a gleaming black stone after a great tornado. Elders polished it into a pendant, worn by the medicine man for protection. They said it was no ordinary rock but a shard of the sky itself, dropped into his hands by the spirits. Archaeologists today confirm that meteorite pendants, polished smooth by generations, were indeed found on those plains. For the Iron Plain, it was as if the storm had delivered a cosmic gift basket, and they knew better than to refuse it. But faith alone wasn't enough, they prepared, too. The Dawnfield clans built their survival into their very routine. They stockpiled food long before the first funnel appeared. Dried venison, ground roots, berries pressed into cakes, and pemmican made of fat and fruit were buried in waterproof hide bags, hidden beneath stones or near tree roots. These secret caches were their insurance policies. If the main food stores blew away, they could dig up their hidden pantries and endure. It was their way of saying to the storm, you can strike us, but you will not starve us. Some took it further. The Firestep clan stashed weapons and tools in caves and beneath rock piles, prepared for the day when disaster might strip them bare. Spears, flint knives, bows, and even cooking pots were cached away, waiting like faithful sentinels. A tornado could flatten their world, but when they rose from the ruins, they would never start from nothing. Rebuilding was never a solitary task, it was the heartbeat of the entire village. Men scouted for new poles, cut fresh timber, and hunted again for meat. Women stitched torn hides, shaped new garments, and mended shelters. Children combed the grass for beads, scraps, and anything that could be reused. The Skybrook had a saying, we rise as one. It meant that storms might knock them down, but together, their strength was multiplied. Even the land itself offered renewal. A twister could rip open a field, clearing grass and scattering debris. The Meadowthorn people would burn the leftover brush, then plant crops in the fertile churned soil. Corn, beans, and squash grew strong where storms had scarred the earth. It was as if nature itself had plowed their fields. Sometimes they marked the land scarred by twisters with cairns or pictographs, warnings for generations yet unborn. These stones whispered, here, the sky once descended. Beware. Their marks were not only reminders of fear but of wisdom, carved into the land so that others might live. The storm always took, but it also gave. And the Skybrook people, in their humility and resilience, learned to see both. For the Ashvale people, the land itself remembered. After storms ripped through, they would mark the scarred places with cairns of stone or carved pictographs on nearby cliffs. To travelers, it was a silent warning: the sky once touched here, tread carefully. To the Ashvale, it was more than a marker. Each pile of rocks was a story, a reminder of lives lost or saved, a lesson carried forward without the need for books or ink. The children would gather around these markers, and elders like Eamon Swiftcloud, in his 80s, would point and say, "Here the wind came down. Here we listened. Here we learned." It was history etched into the earth itself. But resilience wasn't measured only in rebuilding homes or tools. It lived in the heart. After a tornado passed, the Ashvale gathered for ceremonies of healing. Their circle of tears ritual honored those lost, gave thanks for those spared, and knit the spirit of the people back together. They sang, they prayed, and they wept openly, letting grief flow into the ground as offerings. Only when the last song faded did they rise, lighter, ready to face the next trial. It was emotional intelligence centuries before therapists and counselors gave it a name. For the Ashvale, survival wasn't just about holding on to shelters. It was about holding on to one another. The storm could tear hides from poles and scatter buffalo bones across the prairie, but it could not scatter their unity. That was their true strength. And from that unity blossomed culture. Tornadoes, though feared, also became fuel for art and imagination. Among the Windhollow, artistry was as vital as hunting. They painted spirals and storm spirits onto hides, recording not just battles and hunts but the wrath of the sky itself. One famous piece, the Sky Coil Ledger, sketched in the 1880s, shows lodges spinning like leaves, warriors bracing against the gale, and children clinging to their mothers. It was not just a memory, it was resilience made visible. Others turned destruction into sculpture. The Stone Branch people would search storm debris for twisted wood or rocks wrenched from the ground, calling them gifts from the breath. With ochre paint and steady hands, they carved these into totems shaped like spirals, jagged bolts, or horse-headed spirits said to ride the storm. These weren't meant for display in museums but for lodges and sacred circles, reminders that chaos could still be turned into beauty. Women carried this tradition with special devotion. In the Thornvale societies, quill embroidery was their language. They stitched patterns of spirals, jagged lightning, and rushing wind into garments, bags, and cradleboards. A mother wrapping her child in a blanket adorned with storm motifs wasn't just giving warmth, she was wrapping her little one in memory, warning, and protection. Imagine standing in a lodge, the walls stitched with patterns that told of storms past. Imagine a child tracing those spirals with small fingers, asking, "What does this mean?" And hearing their mother reply, "It means we endured. It means you will endure, too." The Ashvale didn't just survive storms. They sang them, carved them, stitched them, and remembered them until the wind itself seemed part of their culture. In every song and every stitch lived the promise: the storm may howl, but we will not be silent. For the Windvale people, survival was stitched, sung, and spoken into memory. Their moccasins were more than shoes, they were stories. A spiral quilled into the leather might tell of a storm that spared a camp. A jagged line across a bag could recall the night a funnel cloud tore through the lodges. Archaeologists later uncovered Windvale quillwork with patterns of swirling wind and lightning, evidence that these people quite literally carried their survival stories on their bodies. It was history worn into daily life, a reminder with every step: we endured, and we walk forward still. Stories by the fire carried the same weight. Elders told of Caelan Swiftstride, a reckless young warrior who once challenged a tornado to a race across the plains. He rode his fastest horse, believing he could outrun the sky itself. He lost, of course, but survived by throwing himself into a gully at the last moment. From then on, his friends called him Storm Runner, teasing him, yet honoring the lesson he gave. For children listening, the moral was clear: when danger comes, seek low ground. It was a teaching hidden in laughter, the kind of wisdom that stayed long after the embers cooled. The meadow fern told their own tale, of a girl named Leora who sang to the storm. As the funnel approached her village, she lifted her voice in song. Whether by chance or spirit's mercy, the tornado veered away, leaving her people safe. Mothers retold this story to their daughters, not as proof of magic but as proof that courage, even in small bodies and young voices, could shield an entire village. Visions were another way storms shaped lives. Among the skycrest, boys fasting on hills during vision quests sometimes witnessed tornadoes spiraling across the horizon. To see one during such a trial was no ordinary sight, it was destiny. One account speaks of a youth who endured 3 days without food, only to see a funnel cloud dancing across the fields. He returned gaunt but determined, convinced the spirits had charged him with guiding his people. And he did, leading them through a bitter winter with resilience they swore came from the storm itself. A 200-mile-an-hour wind may sound like a strange mentor, but in a world where every sign mattered, it was guidance carved into the soul. Music carried these lessons even further. The Ember Lake people played flutes carved from river cane or hollowed eagle bones, their melodies rising like the howl of a distant twister. Medicine men led chants after storms, thanking the spirits when lives were spared, mourning when they were not. The thunderdrum ceremony was their most powerful ritual, held each storm season. Great drums, painted with spirals and bolts, echoed the boom of the sky. Each strike was both respect and defiance, a rhythm that said, "We hear you, storm, but we remain." Even creativity itself was linked to storms. The Iron Branch storytellers compared their art to tempests, old tales torn apart and retold, reshaped as new storms reshaped the land. It was resilience in story form, a reminder that change wasn't loss, but renewal. For the Windvale, storms weren't just survived. They were sung, stitched, and sculpted into identity. And each retelling, each note, each stitch whispered the same truth: the wind may roar, but our voices will always rise above it. For the Storm Hollow people, survival after a storm wasn't just about patching shelters or gathering food. It was about weaving broken hearts back into one thread. When the winds had passed and silence fell heavy on the prairie, the people gathered together, not in despair, but in ceremony. Their ritual, called the clearing of tears, honored those lost, gave gratitude for those who endured, and reminded every soul that life moved forward. The old women sang songs that trembled like the wind itself, while men shared stories of ancestors who had faced storms even fiercer. Children listened wide-eyed, learning not only to mourn but to hope. These gatherings weren't just therapy sessions. They were acts of resilience, a way of knitting spirits into a single fabric strong enough to face the next storm. Elder Anna, a sky voice, who had survived more than 70 winters, often told her people, "The wind takes much, but never each other. As long as we gather, we remain." Symbols of storms made their way into every corner of life. Warriors of the Thornridge clan painted spirals and jagged streaks onto their horses before a raid, believing it lent them the ferocity of the sky. It wasn't vanity, it was belief, a way of channeling the chaos around them and turning it into strength. The sight of painted horses charging across the plains was not just terrifying, it was spiritual theater, the storm embodied in flesh and bone. Art, in all its forms, wasn't just expression. It was a weapon, a prayer, a survival tool. By painting, singing, carving, and weaving their storms, the Storm Hollow people transformed fear into beauty, chaos into meaning. Creativity wasn't a luxury. It was a lifeline, binding them to their land and to one another. And the greatest task of all was passing this wisdom forward. No scrolls or books existed here. Knowledge was living, carried in voices, dances, and practices repeated across generations. Elders served as libraries, their memories holding the keys to survival. They took this duty with gravity. To forget a storm was to invite death. At night, the people gathered around fire pits. The elders spoke, their voices slow and steady, describing storms of the past with the gravitas of prophets. One story told of a camp flattened in the early 1800s. Survivors had fled into a buffalo wallow, lying pressed against the earth as the wind shrieked overhead. Another described a signal fire set by a scout, its smoke curling in the strange silence before a funnel appeared, warning families to flee. These weren't bedtime tales. They were survival guides disguised as stories. Even history itself became picture and memory. The Sunfield people kept painted calendars on hides, recording storms beside hunts and births. One famous record shows a storm in 1907, spirals sketched in red, lodges scattered like seeds. When children misbehaved or resisted advice, mothers pointed to the drawings, see. This is why you listen. The sky has no mercy for the stubborn. By the time they were 6, children already knew the language of storms. They could read the sky's silence, the way clouds stacked like towers, or the twitch of a horse's ear before thunder cracked. Lessons were often games. Races to the nearest ditch or rock weren't simply play, they were rehearsals for survival. What seemed like laughter was actually training, preparing the young so instinct would guide them when fear tried to take hold. In Storm Hollow, survival wasn't just inherited, it was taught, sung, and lived into every child's bones. For the Emberfield children, training wasn't just about chores or play, it was about learning how to stay alive when the sky turned wild. The games they played weren't ordinary games. Racing to see who could dive into a gully first, hiding behind boulders when elders shouted, "Storm," or practicing how to crawl low in the grass, each round of laughter carried lessons carved into instinct. The winner got bragging rights, yes, but the real prize was survival skill polished by practice. By their teen years, these children could read the horizon as sharply as the elders. They were no longer just learners, they were protectors in training. Women were the true teachers in this transfer of wisdom. They passed down stormcraft with patience, sarcasm, and love. Marin Willowshade, a mother of 4, often had her daughters patch storm-flayed hides. If the stitches were sloppy, she would tug at the seam and say with a smile, "You think that will hold against the sky's anger? Try again." Through repetition, those girls grew into women whose hands could reinforce a lodge strong enough to withstand gales. Archaeological remains of heavy anchor stone rings across the Emberfield Plain stand today as quiet proof of their skill. Knowledge was also carried in song. The Thornlight clans used chants to teach storm signs, green-tinted skies, sudden silence, restless horses. Sung in rhythm, the words stuck in memory like a tune you couldn't shake. A young warrior humming on patrol might suddenly stop, scanning the horizon as the melody reminded him, "Seek low ground, secure the lodge." In the 19th century, one chant described a tornado as the sky's angry dance, embedding wisdom in poetry that could be passed from mouth to ear for generations. Rituals doubled as classrooms. The Storm Peak people held ceremonies to honor Whirlwind Mother, but the dances were not only spiritual, they were practical lectures in disguise. Elders pointed to certain hills, teaching that ridges offered protection, while valleys brought death when rains and winds converged. Young men and women danced, offered tobacco, and learned in the process. It was like a community seminar where the lesson plan was survival, and the instructor was both elder and spirit. Some even created mock storms to drill their people. The Ashglen would stage tornado exercises, with warriors shaking lodges and children practicing dives into safe spots. The noise, the chaos, the pounding of feet, all designed to mimic fear without the risk. It wasn't just for show. When real storms came, the people moved in harmony, their bodies guided by memory and practice. Stories tell of children who grew into adults known by names like Storm Dodger or Wind Runner, earned from their quickness and courage in these drills. Even the environment became a classroom. Elders led children to storm-scarred places, fields where earth had been churned, groves of trees twisted into grotesque shapes. Standing before a splintered cottonwood, Elder Darren Cloudbear once told a boy, "This is what happens when you ignore the warnings." The child touched the scarred bark, and the lesson cut deeper than any lecture. The Emberfield people believed storms could destroy, but they also believed storms could teach. And by turning drills, songs, and stories into muscle memory, they ensured each generation rose wiser, stronger, and ready to face whatever the sky demanded. For the Dawnridge clans, memory was more than words. They left stone markers near storm-scarred sites, chiseling spirals or storm-bent trees into the rock so their children would never forget. Long after the winds had passed, those carvings stood like silent teachers, whispering, "This is where the sky once fell. This is why we must listen." Families would walk their children to these places, pointing at the etchings, the silence heavy with lessons carved by both storm and hand. Storytelling, too, became a way to bind knowledge into life. The Emberwind tribes held competitions where young men and women vied to retell the most vivid storm tales. Around the fire, voices rose, some trembling, some bold, as they described nights when the lodges lifted, or mornings when the sky turned green as glass. Elders judged not just flair but accuracy. A tale told well could win a feathered belt, but the true prize was the preservation of wisdom. The children laughed, gasped, and learned all at once. It was more than entertainment, it was survival disguised as story. By turning storms into contests, the Emberwind ensured the lessons of vigilance, courage, and humility would never fade. Each new generation inherited not just tales but the readiness to live them. Yet memory and story were not enough. Tools were their other great defense. And at the heart of their survival stood the lodge, the taipai. These weren't mere tents, they were fortresses of hide and bone, crafted with precision born of necessity. Buffalo hide stretched across poles of ash or cedar formed a conical shape that laughed at the wind. When the storm struck, air curved around the sloping sides instead of tearing through. The open top allowed smoke to escape yet prevented the whole structure from lifting like a kite. The Skyvale women, in particular, were masters of stormproofing. Before the storm season, they sewed extra hides along seams, reinforcing the walls with sinew thread that held tighter than most modern ropes. Their stitches were born of experience, lines of survival sewn with hands that knew every scar the winds could leave. Archaeological sites in the northern plains have revealed unusually large anchor stones circling ancient taipai rings, evidence of this foresight. In some villages, families lashed their lodges together with braided grass ropes. When the storm howled, one lodge stood not alone but bound to its neighbors, a network of strength against the chaos. Elders said it was more than engineering, it was symbolism. Just as the ropes tied homes together, so did storms tie the people. No one survived alone. Even their weapons bent to survival. Spears weren't only for buffalo hunts. A warrior could drive his spear deep into the ground, anchoring a shelter or marking a safe path in debris. Light shafts of willow tipped with flint became both weapon and tool, reminders that adaptation was survival. Compared to the boxy wooden homes settlers later built, easily splintered by storms, the Dawnridge structures were fluid, humble, and wise. They weren't designed to defy the wind. They were designed to work with it. In every stitch of hide, every carved marker, and every story shared by firelight lived a truth: the storm would always return, but so would the people. And they would be ready. For the Ironwool people, survival demanded invention as much as courage. When the storms came, every tool became a lifeline, every scrap of bone or hide another chance to see the dawn. Warriors sometimes drove their spears into the soil, anchoring hides into makeshift shields to protect children or sacred bundles. To outsiders it might look desperate, but to the Iron Will, it was ingenuity born of love, the determination to keep their little ones safe no matter what the sky hurled down. Even bones became tools. The Stone Creek clans fashioned shovels from buffalo shoulder blades, their broad, strong curves perfect for digging emergency pits. Archaeologists near the Silverbrook River in present-day Oklahoma have found these bone shovels, their edges worn smooth by years of scraping earth. Picture a mother gripping one of these crude blades, her hands raw, as she dug a trench deep enough to press her children inside while the world above howled. It wasn't elegant, but it was survival. Storage was another craft turned art. The fireplanes carried rawhide pouches called parlesh, folded like envelopes to seal in food, tools, or sacred stones. Waterproof and nearly indestructible, these pouches could be buried to outlast even the fiercest winds. For a family scattered after a storm, unearthing a cache of dried meat or flint tools could mean the difference between despair and hope. The Starcrest went further, tucking reserves of dried corn and pemmican into caves, the entrances marked with subtle signs, carved sticks, stone piles, cryptic only to those who knew. Imagine stumbling through wreckage, hungry and exhausted, only to find a hidden pouch of food buried months before. To them, it was as if their ancestors had reached forward in time to save them. Storms, destructive as they were, also became strange allies. The Embervale tribes learned to scour tornado debris for treasures. Twisted wood could be shaped into sturdier bows, while flint and stone churned from the earth provided razor-sharp arrowheads. Excavations in Kansas have revealed flint workshops near storm-damaged areas, proof that the people gathered where the winds had struck hardest, turning chaos into opportunity. For them, a storm's wreckage was not only ruin but raw material, a strange gift from the whirlwind itself. The prairie-born wove survival into rope. Using buffalo hair, they braided storm cords, supple yet strong, carried in every pouch. In moments of panic, a mother could lash her child to her waist or tie a family together, ensuring no one was torn from her grasp. Oral stories speak of one prairie-born family that endured a great storm bound by these cords, huddled together like stones in a river current. When the winds passed, they emerged whole, proof that even in chaos, love held tighter than fear. Knowledge itself was a tool, and fire was its sharpest edge. The Windmere knew the prairie's grasses were fuel waiting for a spark. To fight fire, they set fire, burning controlled patches in early spring before storm season. This reduced the tinder that lightning could ignite. Charred scars still marked the Black Hills, silent evidence of their foresight. Each controlled burn was more than strategy, it was a pact with the land. The people would tame a little flame now to save their families from a greater inferno later. For the Iron Will and their neighbors, technology was not about luxury or ease, it was about trust in bone, hide, fire, and memory. In every shovel carved from a buffalo's shoulder, in every braided cord, in every hidden cache was an unspoken vow, we will endure, because we must. For the Storm Hollow tribes, even their clothing was a form of defense against the sky's wrath. Hunters wore moccasins fashioned from buffalo hide, their thick soles tough enough to carry them across jagged plains when a storm demanded flight. Women stitched robes with multiple layers, not only for warmth but for protection. These garments often bore patterns of spirals and lightning, symbols meant to guard the wearer from harm. When the winds rose suddenly, a mother could pull her robe over her child's head, shielding them from biting hail or flying debris. It wasn't perfect, but in those frantic moments, it was enough. To the Storm Hollow, every stitch carried love, faith, and preparation. As we step back from these vivid lives, it becomes clear that the people of the plains did more than endure storms, they outsmarted them. Their shelters, tools, clothing, and rituals were not just clever, they were born of necessity, sharpened by generations of loss and survival. What might seem crude to modern eyes was, in truth, a seamless blend of practicality and spirituality. To them, tornadoes were not just natural disasters. They were teachers, demanding respect and offering harsh lessons in return. This story doesn't end with the fading thunder of one season or the disappearance of the buffalo. The legacy of resilience carried forward, woven into the lives of their descendants. The Windcrest Nation, for example, now lives in houses of brick and wood instead of hide and bone, yet elders still gather children in Oklahoma community halls to tell stories of the sky that walks in circles. They mix tradition with modern tools, teaching kids to watch for restless animals or the stillness before a storm while also checking phone alerts. It's like pairing a compass with a weather app, old wisdom walking hand in hand with new technology. In 2013, when the monstrous El Reno tornado threatened their lands, Windcrest elders performed rituals as their ancestors had. They lit sacred fires, raised prayers with tobacco, and spoke to the storm. Meteorologists later claimed it was simply shifting wind dynamics that pushed the twister away from the main settlement. But the Windcrest people knew what they felt in their bones, that they were still connected to the same forces their ancestors faced, and that respect still mattered. Modern communities have found ways to keep this wisdom alive. Some hold seasonal, sky ceremonies, blending cultural songs with practical training. Children practice diving into shelters, then sit to hear stories of storms survived long ago. Workshops led by elders cover everything from food preservation to recognizing the metallic smell of charged air. These gatherings are not nostalgia, they are lifelines, ensuring no child forgets that the land itself still speaks. The Storm Hollow legacy has also left its mark on how we, today, think of disaster readiness. Their quick mobility, once a matter of life and death, is echoed in evacuation drills and storm shelters. Their resourcefulness, turning storm debris into tools, weaving cords from buffalo hair, painting survival into art, reminds us that resilience is not just about rebuilding. It is about facing destruction and answering with creativity, unity, and heart. Their story is not gone. It moves with the wind, rests in the soil, and speaks through the voices of their descendants. The storms will always come. But so will the people. The Storm Ridge people believed survival was not just about bracing against the wind, it was about remembering where to stand. Their old wisdom of diving into low ground, whether a ditch or a hollow carved by buffalo, still echoes in modern safety guides. FEMA might never mention the Storm Ridge by name, but every time someone is told to flatten themselves in a ditch during a tornado, they are following the same lessons carved into the memory of these people centuries ago. Their mastery of fire was another inheritance to the world. The Brightwater clans practiced controlled burns, setting small blazes before storm season to clear away dry grass. This simple, dangerous, but ingenious act kept wildfires from sweeping through camps after a lightning strike. Today, agencies like the U.S. Forest Service use nearly identical techniques, with maps, science, and budgets, yet it began with families crouched in the wind, using flame to protect what they loved. Even their myths stretched farther than the horizon. The Cloud Runner Nation told of Ayanna, the horse-headed storm spirit who raced across the plains with a tail of lightning. Fragments of her story seeped into wider culture, stripped of her depth and sacred meaning, but alive nonetheless. Next time someone watches a film where a storm has its own mind, its own fury and voice, know that the Cloud Runner told it first, their voices rising over campfires long before Hollywood scripts. And their art, oh, their art was the memory of survival made visible. The Redstone people painted storm spirals onto hides, stitched them into moccasins, even carved them into stones left along trails. Each swirl was not just design, it was a history, a reminder that storms had come before and would come again, but the people had endured. Today, their descendants paint similar patterns in modern ledger-style drawings, their pens echoing the quills of their grandmothers, reminding the world that tornadoes were never just weather, they were characters in their story. At gatherings, the Skyvale people still dance the thunder step, a rhythm born to honor the sky's temper. Drums echo thunder, feathers whirl like lightning, and for a moment, dancers and storm are one. It is survival turned into celebration, grief shaped into beauty. The storms that once threatened to erase them now live in the very heart of their culture, not as enemies, but as reminders of strength. The Meadow Peak Nation has gone further still, turning their storm lore outward. At cultural events, elders tell outsiders of Whirlwind Woman, the spirit who punished arrogance but rewarded humility. They share stories of children who learned to read the sky and warriors who tied families together with storm cords. These are not just tales for applause, they are living lessons, invitations for a world that often forgets the language of the land. When tornadoes struck the plains again in 2019, destroying homes of the Ashwood tribes, neighbors shared food, axes, tarps, and firewood just as their ancestors once did. No waiting for outside aid, no paperwork, just people helping people, bound by memory and duty. That is the heart of their survival, community. And so, as this journey closes, it is clear. The Plains tribes did not merely survive tornadoes, they turned storms into teachers, grief into rituals, debris into art, and chaos into community. Their legacy is not only one of endurance, but of transformation. The winds howled, and the people answered, not with fear, but with resilience that still whispers across the prairie today. It's a reminder you don't need a tower of technology to outwit the wind. What the Stonebrick people carried was far more enduring: sharp eyes, steady hands, and a trust in one another that was stronger than any storm. Their wisdom was carved into every choice: where to camp, how to build, when to move, when to wait. And at the center of it all was a simple truth: respect the wind, or it will teach you why you should have. That truth still whispers through the grasslands. In the Whispering Plains, where the horizon never ends, the descendants of the Storm Hollow clans continue to read the sky. They may live in houses now, built from brick and steel, but the old lessons linger in their bones. When the air grows still and the dogs begin to whine, when the clouds turn green and the prairie smells like metal, an elder will quietly remind the children, listen. The sky is speaking. Think of a grandmother named Elira, well into her 70s, sitting on her porch in Kansas as a siren wails in the distance. She remembers the stories of her people, how her great-grandmother once tied her children together with braided hair cords to keep them from being torn apart by the wind. Elira doesn't panic. She calls her grandchildren to her side, and in the calmest voice she can muster, she tells them the same stories that once kept her family alive. In that moment, fear becomes something else. It becomes strength passed hand to hand, generation to generation. The Hollow Peak tribes once faced these skies with nothing but buffalo hides and prayer. And yet, they endured. They turned disaster into memory, memory into story, and story into survival. When a twister ripped through their hunting grounds, they didn't call it the end. They marked the scar with stones so their children would know, and they walked forward. When the world scattered their homes, they gathered the pieces, built anew, and sang thanks for the chance to keep going. These people didn't just survive storms, they turned storms into teachers. They learned to see warning in the flight of a swallow, in the silence of crickets, in the shift of the wind. They taught their children to crouch low, to cling tight, to never take the calm before thunder as peace. They knew the wind could steal everything, but it could also leave behind wisdom worth more than gold. So the next time you hear the shriek of a siren, or see a funnel cloud carving across the horizon, remember the Skyborn, the Stonebrick, the Whispering Plains people. Remember that they faced the same storms with nothing but their hands, their hides, and their faith in each other, and they walked away carrying stories instead of fear. Because in the end, that's the greatest legacy they left us, not just how to survive, but how to endure with courage, how to rebuild with love, and how to honor the wind without bowing to it.